Welcome back to a special edition of CBS Mornings. Oscar-nominated, Emmy and Grammy-winning composer Danny Elfman has scored some of the most loved movies of all time. He recently earned 2 more Grammy nominations, including one for the arrangement of the song that you're hearing now from Marvel's Doctor Strange. Anthony Mason visited Elfman in his California recording compound to talk about his creative process and his work on Tim Burton's classic holiday film.
When the score of The Nightmare Before Christmas was played live at Bank of California Stadium last year, Danny Elfman walked out to thunderous applause. Elfman wrote the music for Tim Burton's animated classic.
Is this one of the puppets used in the film?
This is the puppet used in the film. Well, there's several.
He has an original Jack Skellington puppet in his studio.
All his joints move, his fingers move.
Elfman himself was the voice of the skeleton in his songs. Oh, there's an empty place in my bones.
Tim would come over, and he'd bring these beautiful sketches of the characters, and he'd tell me the story a little bit at a time. And as he told me the story, I'd go, okay, that's a song.
What's this? What's this? There's puppet everywhere. What's this? There's white things in the air.
Is there a secret to writing a score?
You lose yourself in the film. I mean, this is something that every film composer has in common. We're wired in a way that if you play scenes in front of us, we'll hear music.
Elfman scored more than 100 films, from Edward Scissorhands to Spider-Man. Men in Black. To Mission Impossible.
You guys get to hear the sounds inside the director's head?
You have to figure out, how do you express yourself through their vision?
Yeah.
And that's hard. That's a trick.
Yeah.
So sometimes, you equally have to be a musician and a psychologist. This is headquarters.
Yeah.
Mission control.
When the industry went silent during the pandemic, the 69-year-old composer started making music on his own, surrounded by antique dolls, heads under glass, and his biggest obsession, hands.
I dreamt my whole life of hands, coming after me, and, what can I say?
It led to an album he called Big Mess.
Just like me, to say I'm sorry. It's just like me, to do it again.
Was this basically the first music you'd written for yourself in decades?
Oh, yeah, definitely.
Since he'd fronted a band called Oingo Boingo back in the 80s and 90s. Then at Coachella this past April, he performed a career-spanning concert.
A crazy show where I mix up old stuff, new stuff, film stuff, and wrap it all together in this ridiculous way.
I know you were nervous about that performance.
I was beyond nervous, but I decided I gotta lock into this, and I took my shirt off, which was how I performed in the 90s, and it brought me back a quarter century, and feeling like sweaty and exposed and raw, which is how I loved feeling on stage.
Your whole film career was an accident, really.
Everything in my life's been an accident. I never intended to get into film scoring. Tim Burton and Paul Rubens approached me to do Pee-wee's Big Adventure.
You tried to say no to that.
I did.
It was 1985, and Burton, a fan of Oingo Boingo, persisted.
And I wrote this piece of music for him. They put it on a cassette and sent it to him, and I thought, I'll never hear from him again. And my manager called me a week later, and he goes, Danny, you got the gig.
It would be the first of 16 films he scored for the director.
Why were you and Tim so compatible artistically?
We both grew up on horror films.
Yeah.
And when I met him, he idolized Vincent Price.
Yeah.
And I idolized Peter Lorre.
Yeah.
That kind of defined us for the next 35 years.
You're probably the most inept housebreaker in all of New England. That's true.
Vincent Price was often the tormentor of Peter Lorre.
Did you try the knob? No. Quiet.
In 1989, Elfman wrote two of his best-known scores. The first was for a new TV show.
You wrote this driving home in the car?
I wrote it in the car on the way home. I actually was hearing it in my head while I was watching it. And as soon as I got in the car, it clarified and I heard all the parts.
You also sang on it, briefly.
That was, in hindsight, the smartest thing I ever did.
Because?
Because my health insurance is still now from singing The Simpsons.
You said, I think, that The Simpsons was probably the easiest thing you wrote, and that Batman was the hardest.
Yeah, well, it was the hardest score I'd ever worked on.
They didn't want you.
They didn't want me. And the producer didn't want me. Only Tim wanted me.
So Tim Burton had him audition for producer John Peters.
Tim says, play the march. Play the march. The march means the titles. And John Peters starts conducting. Then he stands up. And Tim looks at me and goes,
How do you typically approach this? You watch the film multiple times? What do you have to do?
yeah, I watch it a lot, and I live in it. Also, sometimes you're working on a film and you're committed and you like the director, but it's not a very good film.
Yeah.
You still have to give it the same amount of energy, even if you know that your music's not going to save the movie.
Does that make it harder at that point?
Definitely.
What do you do?
You just do the best you can. It's called being professional.
Yeah.
It's the same for all of us in the film.
What a fascinating process.
It is a fascinating process. When a really good movie happens, it's always a little bit of a miracle, It's like nobody sets out to make a bad movie.
Right. Nobody tries to make a bad movie. He's right about that. But I love hearing about how these creative types work.
Yeah.
How their ideas come to them, how they process it, and how they make it all.
It's very genius.
Yeah, it really is.
I mean, you never hear people in Hollywood that talk about having to work on movies that they know are not good,
No,
but having to give it their all anyway, because it's like,
Yeah.
look, I can't fix the whole thing.
Yeah.
My job is this, and I'm going to do a good job.
Yeah.
I love that.
And Danny does a very good
Genius. And he came up with the jingle, the intro music for The Simpsons, which will live in my head forever.
Forever.
That's the generation.
Another Anthony Mason masterpiece.
Right.
Bravo, Anthony
Well
Mason.
done.
All right, up next, Vlad GJ's got the stories you'll be talking about over the holidays, including a surprise from one of his heroes that happened earlier this year, and we still cannot